Hi all, hi. I would like to welcome you all to the first roundtable discussion with PoLAR's Direction Section authors. My name is Deniz Yonucu and I am co-editor of PoLAR's Direction Section and working together with Caroline Parker. And I'll be moderating our roundtable today. After a long break with the initiation and encouragement of PoLAR's new editors, Cindy Sominisi Weeks and Georgina Ramsey, the Direction Section is now back to bring together anthropologists to discuss anthropology's new directions in an ever-changing world and to turn anthropological gaze inwards, reflecting on the ways of doing anthropology and writing anthropologically. With an inspiration from a productive discussion on peer review initiated by Čarna Brković here, hi Čarna, we decided to begin our new journey with a discussion on peer review processes, which tells us a lot about knowledge production in anthropology and its relation to wider structural relations. Čarna and Jennifer Curtis, the editor of PoLAR Online, have also been editing an emergent conversation series on peer review, which I believe is coming up very soon. Many thanks to Čarna again for coming up with this brilliant idea, and many thanks to other Direction Section authors here who also kindly contributed to our first section after a long break and joined us in conversation here today. So before starting our conversation, I'll briefly ask our panelists or authors to briefly introduce themselves. Shall we start with you, Čarna?
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Deniz. My name is Čarna Brković, and I'm an anthropologist who is currently based at the University of Göttingen.
Perfect. I see Dada next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to PoLAR for looking into this conversation tonight. My name is Dada Docot. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Purdue University and a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. I'm currently calling in from Japan.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Saida, you appear to be after Dada.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me join this discussion. My name is Saida Hodžić, and I'm an associate professor of anthropology and feminist gender and sexuality studies at Cornell University.
Perfect. And Madeleine.
Hi, everyone. And thank you again, Deniz, for organising this, and to Čarna for initiating the conversation on peer review. I'm Madeleine Reeves. I'm Professor of Anthropology at the University of Oxford.
Perfect. So I guess we all have dealt with rejections, substantial revision requests at one point or another in our careers, and rejections and the feeling of being misunderstood definitely hurt our feelings. But as Sara Ahmed argues, personal is also structural, and as she says, you can be hit by a structure, you can be bruised by a structure. I cited Sara Ahmed in here. And the process of peer review, as all of the authors here pointed out, are not pointed out in the directions section in their writing, are not independent of power relations and structural forces that hurt the most precarious and disadvantaged members of our community. So today we will discuss issues related to structural inequalities, epistemic injustice, and the matters of accountability in the processes of peer review. All the authors here also came up with suggestions on making the peer review process more inclusive, more accountable, and also, in a way, caring. Care was one of the most repeated themes in the direction sections and in the emergent conversations edited by Čarna Brković and Jennifer Curtis. And they also provided some advice for junior scholars and scholars who write against the grain. So our discussion will also include a short brainstorming or suggestions on how to make this unequal process more just and more inclusive. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the virtual mic first to Čarna and then to Madeleine, because both of you point out the courtroom model of intellectual exchange and underline the importance of thinking with against this. So I'm going to ask you if you could elaborate on that. What do you mean by courtroom model of thinking against? And how does or could thinking with, or in Madeleine's beautiful words, accompaniment, work in practice in the peer review process?
Thanks for that question, Deniz. And let me start by describing an experience that I had last summer. I had a paper under peer review and I received 3 double anonymous, double blind, so-called peer reviews, and all 3 reviews were productive. And generally speaking, they were encouraging, but one of them was somehow different. And there the reviewer decided to somehow sit with me and to think together with me on how to make my argument in the most convincing and most productive manner. And reading this peer review felt a little bit like receiving a gift. And this sense of being given something, of a gift, is not necessarily an affective reaction that I have to peer reviews, or like most of us, I would say. So I started thinking about what was different there, what happened there that somehow turned this into an effectively different kind of an experience for me. And to understand this, I found it useful to differentiate thinking against, let's call it, from thinking with, as somehow broad descriptions of different ways of imagining of how we can relate to one another as scholars. And I would say that many of us have been trained in this thinking with, to think against somehow. We are trained to look for problems in papers, and we are trained to somehow find weak spots in other people's arguments, and this can be intellectually stimulating. This thinking against is very often how we show respect for our peers, for our colleagues, and learning to separate an attack on the person from an attack on the paper and on the argument is a very important part of our jobs, in my view. It can bring somehow, thinking against can bring intellectual joy, some sort of enjoyment, and it can also advance our arguments and our conversations. However, all of that being said, there is a certain problem when we try to, when we write peer reviews from this perspective, when we think against the papers that we are reviewing. And thinking against as a model somehow of imagining of how we should relate to one another as scholars, as members of a scholarly community, is premised upon a certain implicit, unspoken assumption of egalitarianism. So this is what I call the courtroom model of intellectual exchange in that text. So the participants in that kind of an exchange are imagined as equals in some fundamental sense, as pure minds, somehow as bodiless minds also. And this is how courtrooms are supposed to work. So we are supposed to somehow rely on the strength, solely on the strength of our arguments, and rather than our social locations and who we are as people, how we are socially produced somehow as particular persons. And the assumption here is that it is possible to somehow safely disregard socioeconomic differences between us as scholars, including how experiences of sexism, racism, classism, precarity, and so on have shaped our lives and in our thinking. And in practice, as we know, this is not the case. Cultural anthropology shows this is not the case. Feminism shows this is not the case. Critical race studies do, and so on. And all of these bodies of somehow research demonstrate the limits of this model. And when peer reviewing, it might be more useful, more productive to try to think with an author and with a paper that we are reviewing. And thinking with is, I would say, something that we do all the time, but mostly with our students. So it is as if thinking against is what we do with our peers. So with people with whom we are somehow horizontally in the same position. And thinking with is what we do with those who are somehow hierarchically in a different place than we are. And when thinking about that experience from last summer, I find useful Sophie Grace Chappell, who is a philosopher of ethics, and who has this beautiful notion of imaginative identification. And I believe that this notion captures well what it means to think with someone. So thinking with someone means somehow inhabiting their point of view, identifying with them in our imagination, stepping into their shoes. And in the context of peer review, I would say it means trying to think with another person, with the author of the paper, about how to make their point in the most convincing manner possible. And I will end here for now.
I can pick up here from Čarna's, I think, really insightful opening comments. I mean, I agree absolutely, and I think this, you know, if we start to think about where and in what forms we see this kind of courtroom model throughout the academic process, you know, we sort of see it coming up in all sorts of sites, right? If we think of the process of the oral examination on a doctorate, of course, the form this takes in different academic contexts is quite different. But in many European systems, for instance, the external reviewer or examiner is literally called an opponent, an opponent, you know, and it implies this sort of sense in which the role of that person is precisely to try to find problems. It's very much a kind of model premised upon thinking against. And I remember one time when I was co-examining a doctoral thesis, my fellow examiner sort of rearranged the chairs around the table so that the candidate would be sort of sitting across us, you know, across the table to sort of reproduce this architecture in a sense of opposition and defense. And we speak about doctoral defense, right? You know, so these metaphors, this language comes up all over the place. And I think, you know, it's one of the sort of forms that takes then when we kind of bring this to a context of peer review is that unlike a courtroom where we are all visible to each other, there is a selective invisibility which gives or can give license to a peer reviewer in a sense to exceed the bounds in a sense of that role and to precisely separate out, you know, or to sort of precisely blur that boundary between an attack on the work or a critique of the work and a critique of the person. And I think so often the sort of embodied and visceral response to an attack on our work in the context of peer review is precisely because of that slippage, precisely because we feel actually it's not just my ideas that are being critiqued, that the style and the form and the modality of engagement feels that it is an attack on the person. So I think this is partly to do with, as Čarna, I think, very insightfully puts it, the sort of the modalities of engagement with academic work in which we're trained. But I think they are amplified by particular practices and particular conventions of assumptions about what it means to defend one's work. And then that can be, I think, amplified even further in a context of peer review, where there is an intrinsic asymmetry in terms of, you know, the right to reply, the right to engage, the right to sort of, you know, respond to those critiques. And I think, you know, much of that sort of feeling of the insufficiency or inadequacy of peer review when it is in that mode of attack is precisely that it feels that one is being rendered voiceless in that encounter.
Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you, Čarna, for these great reflections. And Madeleine, what you said is also like made me, and also Saida's article too, made me realize that how much this militaristic language is embedded in our academic production process. So we are defending ourselves against an attack. So defense, like being on defense, is coming from this military culture, like military notion of defense. And Saida, and we will come back to this issue in her piece, also attracts our attention to how the editors are named in the academic journals, editors-in-chief. So like going into a war, leading a war. So this is really amazing. But before moving into that connection, that militarized notion, militarized culture embedded in our even academic culture as well, I wanted to talk about also about these invisibilities you mentioned, Madeleine, the invisibility of the editor, reviewer, sorry, not the editor, the reviewer, but also some of parts of our identities we need to render invisible in order to not to be judged or attacked. So all of you in your pieces, each and every single of you underline that the author's gendered, sexualized, sexual or racialized identities work against them, especially when they reveal their identities in their writing, in their writing. So in this regard, Dada, for instance, you shared your experience of publishing in a single blind review process and the difficulties of publishing by going through single blind review, revealing yourself, writing against the grain, using kind of unwelcomed perspectives, terminologies in mainstream anthropology. Would you like to reflect on that experience a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Oh, hi. Thanks again. Thanks for the question, and I appreciate being given the space to add my voice to this conversation. So in my essay that is coming out in PoLAR's Emergent Conversation, I wrote about my experience of the peer review. As you mentioned, it was a single peer review process. It was for a tier 1 journal in anthropology. And you know, as a graduate student before, when I submitted this manuscript, we were told to try to to submit to a tier 1 journal, and maybe we could land the job later on. So I tried, and as we know, single blind peer review means that the author is known to the reviewer, right? But not vice versa. So in my piece, I wrote about my experience, but to summarize here briefly, I received 2 reviewers for my piece. So the first reviewer sent very encouraging and very positive feedback. And in the revision, the first reviewer gave my paper a 1-sentence acceptance. And at that time, I was really, really very excited and happy, right? And then the second reviewer, as we know, the famous reviewer too, as we all know on social media, gave a strikingly different assessment of my work. They wrote that my writing was too soft for a hardcore journal that to which I was submitting to. They attributed the softness of my language to my certain cultural and gender issue. I don't know what the reviewer meant. And in addition to that, they also attached the PDF of my manuscript, which included curse words in the margins. So as a PhD student at that time, I did not know what to do with that. I was not taught how to respond to such attacks on my writing, So also on my revision, reviewer too seemed very upset by my arguments, which they said focused on race identity. And reviewer two also read my manuscript as one with a moralization of my position. So I was read by reviewer two as scolding other anthropologists like them who do not do the work which is similar to mine. So my manuscript used autoethnography, which means that my positionality was already out there, known and visible to the reviewer. Autoethnographers are already easily identifiable, especially if they are racialized or if they work within their own communities. And I identify as an anthropologist of my hometown. My manuscript also began with a film, with an invitation to the reader to watch my film with myself as the main character in the short film. So this means that the single blind review cannot work in my case because the review process is thematically single blind. So you know how in the scientific community, the peer review process is commonly perceived to be objective, right? They always say like, oh, this is the only way to do it because this is an objective process. However, in my piece, I argue that in anthropology, what the scientific community may call objective is very much linked to what has become a scientific canon that is based on a power relationship between a Western anthropologist and the non-white anthropological other. So this power relationship has created a particular kind of canon which requires a certain form of languaging, writing stylistics, and methods that make up what is called scientific knowledge. So if I think the racialized and gendered author is already visible anyway, we are then left with a reviewer who can hide behind a wall of anonymity. You don't have to say who they are. So we are left kind of guessing. So without having to reveal their identity, I felt that a reviewer can write, harmful reviews which could potentially drive authors, not only me, but I think other examples in the collection also mentioned that such reviews could potentially drive us away. So in my case, reviewer 2 came to their desk with assumptions about my identity, and they nitpicked my grammar and writing style as if I wrote only incomplete gibberish, even if my manuscript was already read by 2 professional editors and many peers. So sadly, editors sometimes are not able to properly mediate reviews to filter out abusive and implicitly racist and sexist reviews from anonymous reviewers, such as my experience in submitting to a Tier 1 anthropology journal.
Thanks a lot, Dada. Thank you very much. And your piece was excellent, and I recommend everyone to read it. And Saida, you wanted to reflect on our previous discussion, and now I was also coming to you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, Dada, I want to say that I'm sorry, and also that your experience is familiar from my personal experiences of friends. And I have a couple of comments about that structure of invisibility. And one is that we are actually, as authors, always, or almost always, visible to editors. And this is one of the reasons why in my piece, which we'll talk about later, I'm focusing on editorial responsibility and editorial accountability. And I think that that visibility matters, that our embodied selves matter, that our linguistic selves matter, our affective selves matter. And so that's just one thought. I wanted to also follow up briefly on what Čarna said earlier about the contexts where we have the thinking with, and I was thinking of the writing group as another example where we have thinking with, and where sometimes, we can have that magic happen. So in a writing group, I would say everybody is trying their best, and sometimes we are supported in a way that kind of truly move the piece forward. And how to make that happen, I think it's worth thinking about, but I also think it's not an easy skill to learn, the kind of attention, the kind of overview, the kind of analytical sitting with. I called it magic because the kinds of instructions that these days are being compiled for how to do good review, I'm not sure can directly translate to that, just on the basis to. And in fact, I remember distinctly being invited by, by top tier journals specifically to be as a reviewer, and I've done it a bunch of times, where there's a push for the allegiance to be to the journal. So help us weed out, help us publish only the best, not, and along the way, please also help this person no matter what, right? Please also, think with. And I think that it's something that I certainly also fell for. Even though I reflected, what are my ethics here, and how do I write? Like I would sometimes write in a direct way, like to the person I'm writing to, as a way to kind of be accountable and all of that. But nonetheless, I'm not sure that my own reviews were free from the constrictions that come from that imperative. You are really serving the journal, not the author. And so that's just an added reflection there. Deniz, I don't know if you wanted me to say anything more. I know this kind of shifted the discussion back.
No. I think it's fine. I was actually gonna also ask you, because both you and Dada reflect on the difficulties of publishing autoethnography in anthropology. So I thought it's very much related to the experiences Dada shared with us, being racialized, gendered, opening up yourself in the writing process. So I was going to ask you if you want to reflect on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote about that on the basis of my personal experience of trying to publish something autoethnographic in anthropology, that and how it was handled. And it was, even though the editor themselves had written autoethnographic work, they did not necessarily secure reviewers who think that autoethnography is an acceptable modality. And this is a structural thing. So speaking of, structures that you mentioned earlier, I decided to look up just recently, okay, where do we see autoethnography in titles in journals? And I looked at a couple of journals and I saw that one of my former students, Emily Hong, just published a great autoethnographic piece in cultural anthropology, but it's one of two. So there are limits. And so the problem for me was, well, there are two problems. One is that most of my work is now autoethnographic. It has to just do with a shift from, with an institutional and structural shift of, on the one hand, earning tenure and being willing and interested in putting myself in my work in ways that are not necessarily preconceived by the discipline. So there are ways in which we have always been invited to put ourselves into our work, but they follow coordinates that I'm not necessarily familiar with, nor do I fit in because of the kind of subject that I am, the kind of work that I do. And so it took me a very long time to figure out, and I'm not sure that I'm done figuring out, but to want to do the work of putting myself in the work, but also truly drawing on some other ethnographic insights and methods. And so I'm facing this future of, how do I publish in anthropology while publishing autoethnography, when you have reviewers who will not say, you know what, I actually disagree with autoethnography as a method, and so I'm going to excuse myself, and instead they tear down the article on the on different or allegedly different grounds, but it's very clear that that's the reason. So that's one. But the second is that there's that vulnerability and that visibility that places, in my case, this was a piece on migration and asylum seeking and refuge, in which I'd written about it from an experience as a former refugee, with insecure documents and reflecting on the situation of others. And that kind of parallel of being closer to the subject position of those you're writing about, rather than to be on the other side, those who are writing, I think is discomforting and makes a difference. I think that there's forms of autoethnographic work that are easily capturable and that fit certain categories, that if one can label oneself into those categories, it can even be an opening, right, in certain journals or in, if you have certain reviewers. But if one doesn't, if one questions categories, question ways of knowledge, questions positionings, as well as questions anthropology itself, that can be, well, that's a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a very important issue, apart from the writing style, like being autoethnography a genre. So first of all, autoethnography is like pushing the boundaries of ethnography and to explore the limits of ethnography, to, in a way, to reinvent ethnography. But on the other hand, as you said, like, not the people who have the most wonderful life write about themselves. So actually, those who write autoethnography are the ones who are anthropology's others. But then there's no space for anthropology's others to be anthropology's authors. So I think that tells a lot about the constraints and challenges in our discipline. And from here, I would like to ask all of you, Madeleine, Čarna, and Dada, what other issues do you think is most challenging to address in anthropological journals? What kind of issues are not welcomed or not very welcomed in anthropological journals or anthropology in general? And what does this tell us about our discipline and the processes of gatekeeping in our discipline? So anyone can just jump in. Yes, please, Čarna.
I think I will repeat what Saida and Dada and Madeleine also have said, but in different ways. I think there is a certain limitation when we understand anthropology as a study of the other with a capital O. And this is still very widespread idea that anthropology means studying the other and that we are supposed to produce the cultural critique of us, whereby by us we mean this modern Western English-speaking liberal cosmopolitan subject and so on. And this way of understanding the discipline can work beautifully, and it has produced many wonderful, incredibly important pieces of knowledge. But it is limiting to understand anthropology only in this way, or even primarily in this way, study of the other with the capital O. And there are many anthropologists who cannot sit comfortably in either in them, like the other or the us part of this distinction. And there are many works in political anthropology that somehow challenge and go beyond this understanding of the discipline, the study of the other. And for instance, anthropologists of former Yugoslavia have produced knowledge that doesn't fit into this distinction. As a student, I read brilliant critiques of ethno-nationalism, of intersections between ethno-nationalism and capitalism, of war and genocide, of clientelism and corruption. However, this kind of knowledge is very often understood as somehow locked into area studies conversations, into conversations that seem relevant for particular areas rather than for the discipline more broadly. And this is perhaps why a lot of this knowledge seems to be more visible in interdisciplinary conversations, in conversations with feminism, with political scientists, with historians, peace and reconciliation scholars, and so on. And this is a problem from my perspective, and not so much of a moral problem, because we should be more inclusive, because it is a morally right thing to do, but I think it is epistemologically imagination to understand anthropology is primarily a study of the other with the capital O. It prevents us from understanding somehow other people and places written with a small o as capable of producing politics that is both inspiring and terrifying. And I could make here a parallel with recent leftist writings on the war in Ukraine, but maybe it would take us too far, so I will stop here.
Thanks a lot, Čarna. Somehow all of you guys froze on my screen. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I can jump in with a couple of comments in relation to your question, Deniz, if you'd like. I mean, I think part of the issue as well, I think, alludes back to something that Dada was saying about the pressure on graduate students to publish in so-called tier 1 journals, right? And Saida's comments kind of alluded to this, that if there is this kind of funneling pressure, that there are certain journals that in this kind of prestige economy of anthropology are really gatekeeping journals in a kind of double sense. They're gatekeeping journals because they provide the key to postdoc positions or to a first tenure track job or whatever. I think that this can have the effect of creating sort of particular sort of normative or normalizing tendencies, without this necessarily being the intention of sort of any editorial intention. I think it's one of the sort of the collateral effects of this prestige economy. So I think we really need to interrogate that and where that comes from as well. What does it mean to talk about a tier 1 journal in anthropology, right? In our field, right? When, as Čarna was saying, so much of the really exciting research is often happening in quite marginal spaces, or spaces in area studies journals and interdisciplinary studies journals, and journals that are not sort of marked as anthropology journals. So I think that has particular kinds of effects, because one effect, very obviously, as Saida was saying, is that it can create such a sort of an abundance of submissions to particular journals that then really what the editor wants of the peer reviewer is any reason to find any reason not to publish this article, right? When you have an acceptance rate of, less than 10%, then from an editor's perspective, your preoccupation is how can we find a reason sort of not to run with this, right? So I think we have to kind of think about all these broader structures that reproduce certain kinds of ideas that certain journals carry intrinsically a certain kind of prestige. And then I think there's something else which is, and that comes perhaps with that, is that this prestige economy can then perhaps push authors towards producing sort of big, bold arguments on the basis of sometimes relatively limited ethnography, because what then that journal is looking for, or the way in which one stakes that claim to originality, is by making some sort of very big, bold theoretical claim. So I think it can create then a kind of, you know, an ethnographic disjuncture, as I call it, between the sort of the ethnography and the theoretical claims that are being articulated. And then I think a third factor that again is tied in with this prestige economy is that it can push towards sort of the identification of what Heath Cabot, in a really great critique of the business of anthropology, as she calls it, sort of this drive towards identifying hot topics. And sometimes, you know, certain areas, certain global areas become suddenly hot, right? For you know, for reasons that are actually, you know, when one looks at it, to do with you know, the economics of journal editing, right, and of downloads and so on and so forth. And I've seen this from an editor's side, right? You know, the pressure from publishers, the importance of metrics, the importance of altmetric scores, all of this kind of system, I think, then can lead towards the elevation of certain styles of writing, certain kinds of work, the focus on certain kinds of topic, and the downplaying of other kinds of work. And certainly, you know, it's instructive to me that some of the most sort of subtle and insightful and engaged forms of feedback that I've had on my own work have been not necessarily from those top-tier anthropology journals, but have been from smaller open access anthropology journals, or have been from interdisciplinary journals where the people engaging with one's work you know, have a kind of level of deep ethnographic familiarity with the context that they're able to kind of engage in a very particular kind of way. So I think the issue isn't just to do, you know, in order to engage your question, Deniz, of like which topics kind of do and do not get celebrated and promoted, I think we have to look at the much broader kind of structural economies within which particularly early career anthropologists are having to navigate and to really kind of interrogate that whole system.
Excellent points, Madeleine. Thanks a lot, and thanks also bringing the other side into the table, seeing from the editor's perspective. And I think definitely, like, the prestige economy is one of the keywords key themes that you mentioned. Like, there's this, especially for the junior scholars, Saida also mentions that in her writing, that there are two journals that are advised to the students in the junior scholars in the United States to get published in, otherwise you cannot find a job. It's not even like publish or perish, like publish in this specific two journals. Other than that, you will not be able to find a job or get a good job, like you will be even outside academia. And of course, that puts a lot of pressure on the journals, on the editors, and then there's a long waiting line as well. So does anyone want to comment on, jump in? I can now see all of you again.
I'm happy to talk, but Dada, do you want to go first?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I just have a little bit of comment on Madeleine's response. I feel that for when younger authors submit their work, I think it's not obvious to the reviewers, right, whether or not they're a graduate student. So in my piece, I don't remember any indication that I was a PhD candidate. So I think that's where the assumptions come in. Right, when they see a little Filipina, you know, they think like it's a young person. When I'm not young, I just look a little bit younger, but I'm not. Yeah, so they come with assumptions when they see, for example, in the film, that she's small, she looks tiny, and then that's when they assume that she must be super young, and that's, I think, when they tend to think that let's just keep her out of the gate because she's young anyway and she'll have a lot of opportunity to publish in other journals. So I think that's when I don't know, I think we should also interrogate that, assumptions about PhD candidates not having enough experience, because a lot of us do come, to PhD with already a wide range of experience with, government work or non-government work and teaching prior to joining the academe. Especially if you're coming from the Global South, it's so difficult for us to enter North American academia without having previous experience. Because in the case of the Philippines, we're not even, our education from grade 1 to high school is only 14 years, right? So for us to be able to apply for master's education overseas, I had to take additional master's degree so that I complete the 16 years required. And then I had to do extra year to prepare for TOEFL, even if I already speak English, and other forms of, other mechanisms for me to be eligible when I applied to graduate school. So by the time I was applying to graduate school, I was already quite old. Yeah, so there are assumptions that international scholars of color are younger when actually you might not be. Yeah, so anyway, so in going back to the question, Denise's question about gatekeeping in the discipline. For me, as a junior person, as a junior scholar, I at where I stand, and I don't have a lot of articles in my name, right? Because I'm a third year on the tenure track, and I finished my PhD in 2019. Where I stand now, I feel that the gatekeeping really has to do with how anthropology as a discipline continues to craft knowledge, right? I mean, for many years, for so many decades, we actually really did think that the gold standard in anthropology is going to some distant, to some remote island, and spend 6 to 1 year to study the language and, perfect the language and so on. That was the gold standard, right? But those authors never really say how much of the language they learned, right? So, and then you have all of these authors doing excellent ethnographic work as well. But when we write our own ethnography, we always have to add a footnote or an entire section about our positionality. And then we are interrogated for that. Like, oh, you are too close to your subject of study. For example, when I submitted, when I tried to submit a manuscript to another journal, it was about Filipino migrants, and I myself am a overseas Filipino migrant / scholar. I was told that I was too biased, right? I mean, of course I am biased because I am from a migrant family. I'm a part of the Filipino diaspora, and it's hard to not to be biased. But then again, I was told that I was biased. So even if we have names like Ruth Bihar, Kiran Narayan, and others who have written about ethnography as kind of always judged as a kind of navel gazing. Yeah, I just feel like journals could maybe forward our work to those to appreciate of ethnography and not just keep the gate closed because of the bias that they have as anthropologists of the other versus those who are trying to write about their own communities and hometowns and their own families. So there's a lot to think about assigning work to particular reviewers too, so that our work is not just judged as one with, I don't know, too intimate methods or something to that effect. And of course, I would also like to mention that I joined this conversation as an untenured assistant professor. So in many ways, I'm also very nervous joining this roundtable, but I guess here I am.
Thanks, Dada. Thank you a lot, and thank you for your courage, actually, following up on your first, you managed to turn a rejection letter into an acceptance letter by showing the valid and important points by anthropologizing, actually, reviewer two's gaze, and yeah, thanks also a lot for being here and for the advice also to the editors. I think it's really important that we should be able to expecting that sensitivity from the editors to in sending the articles, works conducted, written by scholars of color, Black and brown scholars or queer scholars to safe hands. at least imagined to be safe hands. So there's no guarantee, obviously, but I think it's very important. Saida, I think you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you. Well, a couple of things. I wanted to follow up on what Dada is saying, to emphasize not just the what kind of work, but whose work. That these are not separate questions, and that they doubly matter. They can matter. You know, there are works that are written by people who experience various kinds of social hierarchies, and that's not necessarily reflected in the work, but nonetheless, the person's identity is known to the editor. And then there are those where that's also reflected in the work, whether it's through the actual themes, or the positioning within the work towards the themes. You know, if one is positioned as a white liberal subject and discusses, let's say, racism from within that, that is not going to produce the same kind of defensiveness in people as it does when the positioning in the text, when the author's positioning is different. I mean, like, we experience that in teaching too. Like, I can teach about racism without feeling the brunt of most of it. Sometimes I can be called, you know, un-American or whatever, but there's, I know I've known for a long time that, you know, one of my first and greatest colleagues, who's a Black woman, she could not teach about racism and have them be accepted. So this acknowledgement that anthropology is not above these socially circulating affects, that we are within them, that's something that I think is missing. I mean, we've seen it recently with respect to sexual harassment and institutional responses. And I see it a lot. We as a discipline are so great at critiquing power, at critiquing institutional structures, structural violence, at thinking through race and gender, but not so much as Deniz, you said, this series is supposed to be about turning the gaze inwards. And so when people turn the gaze inwards, that's towards how these things function within anthropology. There's a lot of pushback. And so I know that, like, for me personally, one of the things that's been challenging, and I've had my work published and recognized, so I want to acknowledge that I'm not speaking from a position of like a victim here. I'm speaking from a position of somebody who was let in various ways and awarded things, and, you know, I have this super privileged tenured job also. But at each point along the way, something that I'm drawn to epistemologically and politically is thinking through how anthropology is complicit with or a part of the governing structures that I was analyzing in my work. So anthropology is for me always an object of study, not just sort of the field of study, and like the work is sort of out there. And that always gets a lot of pushback. And so that willingness for us to really look inwards and to not just say that we do, I find that would be important. And also just a quick note, we've been talking about anthropology, but I would just want to qualify that I think for most of us here, we are for now talking about English-speaking anthropology in the global north, just to not kind of further universalize the already established universally dominant position. Yeah.
Thank you, Saida. Thanks a lot. I think there's a lot to discuss, but we are also running out of time. Do you want to jump in, Čarna, or shall I just move to my final question? How do you feel?
I will just briefly say, I mean, what Saida has just now said, I mean, this is what epistemic injustice and epistemic positioning, the term by Jana Batić, is all about. I mean, this is about who the author is as a person when they submit, for example, an article to peer review, and also about the kinds of knowledge that they draw from it, how they try to link it together. So we've been talking a lot about that. So go on.
Perfect. That's great. Also, now that you brought up epistemic injustice, I also want to mention in anthropology, I mean, my answer, if that question was asked to me, I would say, for instance, I'm always like surprised by the fact to see that interdisciplinary journals are doing a lot of progressivist, path-breaking work on racism. For instance, I work on Turkey, and racism, speaking about racism in Turkey is a huge taboo and always faces backlash. And I'm utterly disappointed to see that on the one hand, I'm really happy that in the interdisciplinary journals, there's this place to discuss about Turkish racism. Right now, there's this new emerging space. But I'm really disappointed also to see the reviewer feedbacks about any issue that is brought up related to racism in Turkey. So I am really surprised to see that this is still happening in our discipline, in anthropology, a discipline who is supposed to be talking the most about racism and other forms of isms. So just to conclude, I will ask you briefly your suggestions, advice for the scholars who write against the grain, because not only junior scholars face backlash or challenges, but things are not always easy for even established scholars who start to write or who write against the grain. So what would your advice be for junior scholars and those who write against the grain?
I upset the question. I have a strong desire to upset the question, and I'll tell you why, and then we can go with the question. So, within the feminist movement, there's been a lot of critique of all the advice is like, here's how to keep safe, here's how not to get raped, right? Which is where the onus is for the people who are in peril to protect themselves. Then there was a pushback by the feminist community, students, activists, others, that says, no, here's how not to rape, right? Here's what not to do. And so I know that at my institutions that has led to like, okay, here's how not to be a passive bystander. Here's what you can do. And so for me, that's kind of a parallel to where we are right now in our conversation. Like, here's how to negotiate these power structures as an author. Now, here's how you can negotiate them as a peer reviewer. That's still within that. So peer review is now like my parallel to the bystander. And I want us to look at, okay, how do we change the actual structures? And I think that that's partly what this conversation is also about. And so I'm fine with us, giving feedback to people who write against the grain and junior scholars to the extent that we have somehow know how, right? I'm not clear that I do, but only if we at the same time question insistently the power structures that make that a place of peril. So.
Wonderful, Saida.
Hi. Yeah, so I think my advice is related to what Saida just mentioned. So I am a junior scholar, so I think I would like to reverse the question a bit. So my advice is actually for senior scholars who would like to help young scholars or junior scholars who are writing against the grain. So I think that the imagination of anthropology requires the active participation and allyship of senior scholars, of the more established scholars, right? As Madeleine mentioned earlier, PhD students, PhD candidates, or younger scholars are often told that we must publish in certain disciplinary journals which are impactful. And we are often told that interdisciplinary area studies, open access journals, and other experimental ones count for much less, so we should not try to do that. But I think that the premium that our senior colleagues place on elite journals must be brought down a few notches, which does not mean that we are lowering standards in anthropology. For me, I feel that our senior colleagues' overemphasis of high-ranking journals justifies peer reviewing traditions that many authors and editors in various journals have already said are problematic and flawed. So to decolonize anthropology, I feel that we must also decolonize the ways we make knowledge available. We must decolonize our practices in our departments to not push, young scholars to hit, American anthropology, American anthropologists, current anthropology, and all the tier 1 journals, right, in North America, and ignore journals back in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. For me personally, I feel that that is a wrong advice. So I invite our senior colleagues who are themselves main movers in the field, who are reviewers and who are editors in top journals, to help junior scholars come into the gate by shifting reviewing and editorial practices towards a path that is more supportive and caring, in addition to changing conversations within the department. Thank you. Thanks for your help.
Perfect. I'm really glad that you turned the question upside down, and it's an important point, relevant, highly relevant. Madeleine or Čarna? Madeleine, it seems like you want to.
I can just jump in. I mean, I think the points that Saida and Dada have made, I totally agree. And I think, turning the question upside down and really interrogating the sort of the processes that reproduce these kind of structural forms of inequity is really important. Given the way that the question was framed, I'm going to have one go at suggesting something quite concrete, which is to recognize, in a sense, that there is a space of dialogue with the editor, and to use, therefore, those when there is, for instance, the opportunity to respond to reviews, to use that forum and to call out those reviews that are, including ad hominem attacks, or that are not constructive, and where relevant to request, for instance, if there are just 2 reviews on a submitted manuscript and they have very divergent responses, and an editor says, well, I'm going with the responses seem to be equivocal, so I'm going to kind of call this a reject, or to push back on that a little bit. And this is acknowledging, I mean, in the context of what Saida and Dada have said, that this is, acknowledging the kind of structural inequities that are built into that review process. But I think sort of to use the cover letter and the space for communication that does exist with editors, because a lot of editors do really want the work and want to publish the work of doctoral candidates and early career scholars. And I think it's also worth sort of reiterating that, because very often that is the work that is the most sort of ethnographically rich and exciting, because because of the differential capacities of people at different points in the academy to do long-term ethnographic fieldwork. So I agree, that we need to turn that question upside down, but in the way that the question is framed, if we're asking about sort of specific advice, I think that's one thing to do, is to think about the cover letter to the editor as a space also to stake out, why one might be writing in a particular way, or including autoethnography, or sort of to acknowledge that. Yeah.
Thanks, Madeleine. Thanks a lot. And I think it's a very important advice also for the junior scholars, especially because most of the time junior scholars we are not trained in our universities, in our programs, how to write and how to go through the review process. So I think that's also very important to be aware of those possibilities, opportunities as well. Čarna, I guess it's your turn.
Thank you. I will make here a very short, brief advertisement for the peer review print section, or the direction section, and the conversation that we are publishing on peer review in the PoLAR journal, and say that many of I think all of the pieces actually which are published there, and many of those who will be published online as a part of the emergent conversation, do include pieces of advice directed to the editors or the peer reviewers. So somehow there is a lot of thinking, and I hopefully useful somehow body of advice that editors and peer reviewers can draw from to think about our editorial and reviewing practices and so on. And as an advice to early career scholars, let's say, or junior scholars and so on, I would say that it is really important to speak up, to somehow share our experience, to talk about their experiences, to connect with one another, to try to find scholars in similar positions or with similar kinds of experiences, which is kind of what we've been doing here in this roundtable, in this whole serious conversation. To try to go back to Sara Ahmed, which you, Deniz, mentioned at the very beginning, to try to form new kinds of collectives and somehow new intellectual and effective communities that would be willing to somehow share this interpretive labor, let's say, that would be willing to think horizontally with our peers. And Saida's example of a writing group, I think, is an excellent example of such a alternative kind of an intellectual community that hopefully emerges, and from such communities to develop shared research projects and maybe even ideas on how to do peer review differently.
Thanks a lot, Čarna, for all the advice and for reminding our PoLAR's peer review discussions. There's plenty of advice actually for everyone in the game. So thanks a lot for your contribution. It was a really pleasure to be here with you today and to discuss about the difficulties in peer review process and the structural inequalities shaping our discipline and the publication processes. So I hope that this would be a conversation starter about peer review and to make it a more just and equal and inclusive and welcoming process for all of us. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Yes, thank you, Deniz and all.